As the saying goes, all good things must come to an end. And today we'll be talking about the last game released on the CPS-3 arcade platform from Capcom, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure from September 1999. As I've been saying for the past few weeks now, Capcom knew the CPS-3 wasn't going to usher in a new era of arcade goodness, and by this point in time, the Dreamcast had essentially proven that arcade games could now be ported to home consoles that were on par or better than their arcade counterparts. That meant arcades were about to leave. Their time in the sun was officially over. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure isn't so much a powerhouse way for Capcom to say goodbye to their arcade platform as it is just a simple refinement over JoJo's Venture. It's basically the exact same game except for some refinements made here and there and the addition of 8 new characters. The gameplay was also broken up into 2 core modes, Challenge and Story. The story mode plays exactly the same as JoJo's Venture, whereby players select a character and play through the manga's 3rd main story arc, Stardust Crusaders. The new characters have their stories loosely tied into the greater storyline, and some of the additions are downright awesome, like a bird. I mean, really, who hasn't wanted to play a fighting game as a bird? How cool is that? The challenge mode puts you in a single round match where you battle one opponent after the other. At the end of the match, you can select to boost your power meter or level points. It's a fun mode if you've already experienced the story from the previous game and aren't overly interested in the new characters. The gameplay is exactly the same as the previous game, with players controlling characters who can perform a wide assortment of special and super moves, as well as the unique stand system whereby characters gain an additional spiritual aid that allows them to perform all manner of crazy moves. Now, instead of repeating everything that I had mentioned in the previous review, I wanted to spend a bit of time today reminiscing about the dying days or the waning days of arcades in North America. So if you're looking for more details about this particular game, go check out my review for JoJo's Venture, as the gameplay is literally identical except for refinements and new characters. So by the time JoJo's Bizarre Adventure hit, I had all but stopped going to the arcades. Every now and then I would drop by and plop a few quarters into some machine, but I had stopped going on a daily basis. Capcom had stopped putting out huge hits by this particular point in time, and most arcade manufacturers had all but given up on arcade releases, save for a few here and there. It was a really sad time, and while I'm going to be moving on to another Neo Geo-ish platform for my next set of arcade reviews, nothing will ever match the greatness that was the CPS-2 and the Neo Geo. Those times were just amazing. While I certainly enjoyed the Street Fighter III franchise on the CPS-3, it was never able to really rekindle the flame I had of just a few years earlier. And the same is true for JoJo here. 3D fighters were all the rage at this point in time, and I must admit that I was playing much more Soul Calibur on my Dreamcast than I was playing anything else in the arcades. And a good buddy of mine had started to purchase arcade hardware towards the early 2000s or so, and I would spend the rest of my arcade days at his place on his Atomis Wave and PGM. Essentially, the CPS-3 would not only mark the end of arcades as we had known them, but also, personally, it marked the end of arcades in general for me. Shortly after this point in time, my local arcade would actually close, and well, without my friend, I doubt I would have played any arcades after the year 2000. While I'm certainly sad those arcade days are over with, I'm very proud to have experienced everything I did. The arcade experience will never again be replicated, and I'm so happy to have been there while they were an important part of modern North American culture. So we end off our CPS-3 coverage appropriately by talking about the waning days of arcades, when an arcade developer who ushered in a whole new era for arcades would slowly burn out with a revision to a wacky game that so few ever played. That's very much the same as the arcade scene. By this point in time, it was a mere shadow of its former self, And while Capcom would go on to produce many excellent titles after JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, they would never again reach the same level of ingenuity, creativity, or excellence that they had when they were pumping out arcade hits and home console classics from the early 90s to the early 2000s. And I know many of you would also argue the 80s, so why not? Let's throw in the 80s there as well. So let's wrap this up by saying if you're a fan of arcade games, do what you can to experience all 6 of these classic CPS-3 games. 5 of the 6 are currently available on the Sega Dreamcast, but all of them are certainly worth your time and money. Arcade games, you will always be remembered for being awesome. So next week we move on to a couple of classics before switching gears to yet another unique and dedicated arcade platform.